everyone. So thankful to be able to join you remotely. Today, if you want to do next slide, today is actually Sine Die, the last day of our short 60-day session. And it's gone by really fast, but it's been grueling nonetheless. And I want to start off just by thanking all of you for your high level of commitment and engagement throughout session, and especially to the Legislative Committee for all the thoughtful conversations that we had and how you all helped steer and guide the direction that we took on our engagement. So my objectives for today's presentation are to summarize our legislative activity and then provide an update on the near final status of legislation and budget items that are aligned with our platform and our strategic plan and areas of authority. And I am emphasizing near final because things are still in flux, even with this being the last day of session. And we have, in some cases, we know that bills are still moving forward, but the House and the Senate are still conversing about which version of the bill. And so I think I'm completely up to date on everything, but there have even been changes within the past 24 hours or so. So you'll have to bear with me. And I also will give just a sneak preview of some of our interim plans as well. Next slide. Okay, so as far as our activity goes, this is kind of a crude way of summarizing it just very quantitatively how our activity went. We signed in support 62 times on 44 bills. We had, as far as testimony, 2 staff and 4 board members providing testimony 10 times on 8 bills. And a lot of our work was behind the scenes, meeting with legislators. We met 33 times with 17 legislators, and this doesn't count all of the meetings that Orlando had as well. On the topic of meetings, I've been keeping track to the best of my ability when board members participate in those meetings as well, and have sent out the PDC reporting summary to everybody. And I think I've received confirmation back from almost everybody at this point. If you haven't yet, please let me know if I've captured all of your meetings or if you have any meetings to add. And then lastly, work sessions. We had 3 of them this legislative session. Bill participated one on ethnic studies curriculum to actually the higher ed committee. And then there was the one on the graduation pathways before the House Education Committee, where Linda and Harriam delivered that one. And then Randy participated with OSPI and WASDA on the coronavirus response one to House Ed as well. Next slide. Thank you. This funnel bar chart shows the bills and how they have kind of died off over the process. This is very typical what we'd expect to see. So we overall tracked 211 bills, and you can see that the biggest decline happens early in session, where they don't all make it through those policy and fiscal cutoffs, and then continue to tail off through each of those cutoffs as that we focus in more and more on what the priorities for the session are, and then kind of plateau a little bit towards the end here. So at this point, we have 42 bills that have passed both houses, the House and Senate, and that represents about 20% of the bills we're tracking. That's very typical. And we're still waiting on concurrence, so that's when the second House makes amendments to a bill. It then goes back to the House of Origin for them to agree, or they can ask the other House to recede from those amendments. And so there's a process, a little bit of back and forth to come to agreement. And there are still a few bills that we expect to see that happen today. And if they can't concur, those few bills could actually end up dying. So we're waiting to see. And then also, of course, the governor signing, is still potential for bills to change if the governor were to veto any section of a bill, or a bill in its entirety, though we don't expect that. Another point to make is that the governor's office has put out a notice of no public bill signings given the coronavirus. So these are usually big celebrations. A lot of folks gather together, different stakeholders, to get their picture taken with the governor when he signs the bills, but that won't be happening this year. They're just going to have the sponsor and maybe a handful of guests by invite only, so not open to the public. Next slide. So what I'm going to do at this point in the presentation is just go through, of those 42 bills that are still alive, about 25 or so of them are priority bills that align very well with our platform and our strategic plan. So I'm going to go through in each area and summarize at a high level what those bills do. Kind of broad strokes because there's so much content to cover, so I'm going to keep the summary really high level, and then if there's time at the end, I'm happy to answer any questions that I can help out with. So just as a reminder that our platform this year built off of the previous year, so with this being the second year supplemental session, we built on the priorities that were established in year one of the biennium. Those were educational equity, school safety, special education, and early learning. And then, of course, also advocating for other legislation as it aligns with our strategic plan priorities. And then we had two modest budget requests. One was the actual request from us, and the other, and that's the high school and beyond plan, local development of credit-bearing options. And then the other one, we were supporting funding that we saw in the governor's budget for some staffing, 2 positions at ERDC. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so this is just the language pulled off of our platform here of what we said about educational equity. So we broadly support legislation targeted to dismantling policies that contribute to predictable disparities, and specifically school funding changes that are equitable based on student needs, and also expanding access to dual credit and expanded learning opportunities for underserved students. Next slide. So within this area, there were several bills that passed, and I've also put dollar amounts next to them. This comes from the conference committee operating budget that just got released yesterday afternoon. So Orlando and I went through and we've attached dollar amounts where we could find them in the budget. And so this is all still tentative, of course. We won't know until the end of today here, and then also wait to see for any changes that the governor could make when he signs the budget. But as far as our early glimpse at what that the conference committee budget, where the Senate and House come together in agreement, these are the dollar amounts that we're seeing. So the first one that I want to highlight, it's not education specific, but it's really exciting for the state as a whole. And this is the Office of Equity bill, which establishes an office within the governor's office to promote access to equitable opportunities and resources that'll reduce disparities and improve outcomes. And so this office will be responsible for a number of things, like providing technical assistance to the state agencies to help all of us apply an equity lens to our work. They're also going to do community engagements, set policies and standards, and data and accountability, so quite a few responsibilities. Importantly, they are not to supplant the existing legislative committees that do this type of work as well, the ethnic commissions or the EOGOAC. This is not to supplant those groups, so this is in addition to. And so that's really exciting work. And as you all think about the Equity Summit moving forward, this might be a great thing to tie into, and the resources and technical assistance that we can rely on coming out of this office. Another one to mention is Senate or House Bill 2711, Educational Outcomes. And this is OSPI to convene a work group focused on students in foster care or experiencing homelessness. And this builds upon work that came through a budget proviso a couple years back called the Project Education Impact Work Group. and Treehouse and WASAC and DCYF and OSPI and several others have been working together, and it's been a really strong, successful group. And this will build upon that work. And it also changes up the membership a little bit and puts some legislative members onto the work group as well. Another one, 6066, is ethnic studies materials. This is expanding materials and resources for use in all grades rather than just grades 7 through 12. And the data sharing with schools and tribes bill, this is for WASDA to develop a model policy and procedure around data sharing. And then this bill, 6561, was not originally on our tracker, but Orlando thought it would be a good addition here, and I agree with him. This is more in the higher ed sphere, but of course will be super important for aspirations of our K-12 students as well. And so this is a student loan program for undocumented students so that we can offer low interest loans to resident students who would not otherwise be eligible for federal student loans because of their citizenship status. And then I'm just going to make a quick mention of a few bills that did not pass but were priorities for us. So there was a dual credit direct cost bill. This is the OSPI request legislation bill, and it had the goal here was so that students and families would not have any costs incurred for participating in dual credit. And the idea behind this was that school districts would cover the cost of exam-based dual credit in college and the high school, beginning in the 21-22 school year, and CTE dual credit in 22-23. And then the institutions of higher ed to cover the running start fees and then books and supplies down the road with a phase-in. This one, there was a lot of debate around this one, and it did not make it all that far in the process, but we know that there's a lot of passion and shared interest in the priority of getting those costs off of students and families, and so we expect to see this come back up for sure. Another one was the Equity Training in Schools bill. This is 5908, which was revived due to actually the Staffing Enrichment Work Group bill. The original version of that one didn't include this piece, so this one got revived, but unfortunately didn't make it. And then the Teaching Tribal History bill, this is the one that our board member, Bill Kalapa, testified on this one. And it would have required school districts to incorporate curriculum about history, culture, and government of their nearest federally recognized tribe. But that one also did not quite make it. And some of these bills, I believe those last two made it all the way to the House Ed exec. They were scheduled for exec, but it was on the day of the sexual health education bill, which took up all the time. Next slide, please. Budget-wise, a couple of other things. So although the dual credit bill did not move, what we do see in the budget is $150,000 for the Student Achievement Council to convene a task force to look into barriers to dual credit, and both financial and non-financial. So in last year's budget, OSPI was tasked with writing a report on how the cost could be no cost to students or families, but within existing resources. And so that's why their proposal turned out that way. This is a broader assignment here to now look at both financial and non-financial aid barriers. And if you dig into the details of the budget, it outlines some specific things that they want them to look at. It doesn't say who is on the task force, so I think that'll be up to WASAC to determine. And then there's $75,000 for a grant program for school districts to create systems, policies, and practices to address racial discipline gaps. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for school safety, we have the support of a statewide framework for mental health support, social emotional learning, and trauma-informed instructional models, and supporting that as well through regional coordination. Next slide. And for this one, I've combined it with our strategic plan area of student well-being and grouped together bills that fall under both of these since they're so closely connected here. And so quite a few bills this session. This was definitely a hot area. So we have a suicide prevention ID cards bill. This one is a simple bill that says that school districts and public institutions of higher education are to add in, the suicide prevention organization information onto their student and staff ID cards within existing resources. But they don't need to do it right now. They can use up whatever cards they have right now, and it's just the next time that they're ordering cards to print some additional information on those cards. And so that's how they think it can be done within cost. Then there's the Children's Mental Health Work Group. This one extends that existing group and also establishes an advisory group on school-based health and suicide prevention. There is a school and classroom climate bill that would have a WASDA model policy developed for nurturing a positive social and emotional school and classroom climate, and then requiring districts to adopt and periodically review this policy, a policy consistent with that model policy. Right now, this is one of those bills that we're waiting to see concurrence. There was an amendment to this in part because it looks like the Senate is trying to add on some aspects from their immigration status bill that did not pass. They're putting that onto this one, and so we're waiting to see how that turns out. If that does go through, it would also have added to this model policy information to parents and guardians about students' right to a free public education regardless of their immigration status or religious beliefs. So we're waiting to see how that one turns out. Sexual health education, this was the big bill for, or one of the top education bills this session. Considerable amount of public input on this bill as well, and it did pass. Both came to agreement on it, and what it does is it defines comprehensive sexual health education. It's age appropriate and inclusive of all students regardless of their protected class status, and materials must be medically and scientifically accurate and use language and strategies that recognize all members of protected classes. This requires every public school to provide comprehensive sexual health education to each student by the 22-23 school year, and there's a phase-in where it starts with grades 6 through 12 and then followed by all. And it also establishes differentiated instructional requirements. So for students in grades K through 3, comprehensive sexual health education really means instruction in social emotional learning, and then a different definition for students in grades 4 through 12. And then the bill also establishes requirements for the frequency of instruction for different grade level groupings. So students would receive instruction at least once in grades K through 3, once in grades 4 through 5, twice in grades 6 through 8, and twice in grades 9 through 12. And the public schools still retain the authority to choose their curriculum, but then if they develop their own or choose a curriculum that's not on the OSPI list, then there's a review to make sure that it complies with requirements. Okay, and I'm just gonna breeze through these. I know I have already spent a lot of time and there's so much content, so I'm gonna try to pick up my pace a little bit here. So apologies for me of just talk. I'm gonna try to get through these here real quick. So the ACEs bill, the Adverse Childhood Experience, is for the Healthcare Authority to incorporate age-appropriate questions into the Healthy Youth Survey. The Learning Assistance Program, this bill is another one that we're waiting on concurrence for. Both versions, the House and Senate version, appear to increase flexibility in the use of LAP funds. I think the point of contention is to what extent to tie this to the use of the Washington Integrated Student Supports Protocol the House version has it directly tied to that, whereas the Senate version has OSPI studying and making recommendations on whether that should be included with the use of lab funds. There's a couple of other differences between the two versions, so waiting to see how that one turns out. And then the school meals at no cost bill, this one started off a little bit rough, and then got worked out really well over the course of session with some amendments that really addressed stakeholder concern, and by the end, you know, broad support of this bill. And so what it does is it requires schools with students in or below 8th grade that have at least 62.5% directly certify for free school meals are required to participate in the community eligibility provision. And this is the federal program that provides free meals to all students in a school. And there was some concern that in doing this, it would lower the free reduced price lunch percentage of identifying students, which could then jeopardize eligibility for other programs. And that part has been addressed through a hold harmless that basically both for LAP funding and the National Board Certified Teacher Bonus to be based on the percentage of free reduced price lunch in the year preceding participation in the community eligibility provision. What did not pass were a number of bills on school-based health centers. There was a bill to do a work group, a couple of bills on statutory authorization, and a bill on expanding this. Those bills did not make it, but expect to see that come back up. Next slide. Budget-wise, we see a significant investment in school counselors. So almost $32 million for an additional 0.5 FTE counselor per prototypical school for high poverty elementary schools. So that is fantastic. We also see $2.5 million for the mental health and safety network, and this aligns really, really well with our platform. We wanted to see that statewide coordination and the regional support. So this is helping support that work. And then a smaller dollar, but still really important, $75,000 to OSPI to develop curriculum and supports for the health education standards to support teaching emotional, mental, and behavioral health in schools. Next slide, thank you. Okay, so our next area on our platform was special education, and we were acknowledging that funding still falls short in this area, and so we want to see increased funding for students with IEPs and qualifying for the safety net and to support inclusionary practices. Next slide. So there was a bill on this, 6117, supportive of that would have increased the special education multiplier. Unfortunately, it did not pass, and the budget only includes about $2 million for anticipated increases in safety net awards. So this is going to be another thing to revisit. I did put the second bullet point here, I acknowledge, is not specifically a special education item. It's the paraeducator training. I put it under special education because we know that paras are quite often working with students, special ed students, and students with other high needs. And so very important that these paraeducators receive the training that they're supposed to get. And so this is to cover the 2 additional days of comprehensive training. So this will bring them up to the 4. Next slide. Another area is early learning, and so expanding access to affordable, high quality early learning, especially for children of color and children in poverty. Next slide. And so there are a number of bills in this area that passed. This was a pretty hot area this session. The 2 bills that didn't pass were giant omnibus bills that really outlined vision for how we could transform and really expand access to early learning. And so there was a bill by Representative Sen and Senator Wilson both had bills a little bit different, but both similar in regards to being very comprehensive efforts. Neither passed, which isn't surprising given the supplemental session, but served as really good conversation starters. And what we saw instead were a few more focused pieces of legislation that did pass. And so we have the child care provider rating. This one extends the time frame for providers to complete remedial activities in the Early Achievers program and allows them to accept subsidy and ECAP providers to continue receiving subsidy payments while they're doing their remedial activities. And then the Working Connections Eligibility Bill extends the grace period for homeless families to fulfill Working Connections child care program requirements. It previously was 4 months, and now it's going to be 12 months. And then the community-based provider pathways. This creates a community-based training pathway for licensed child care providers to meet professional education requirements, and tasks DCYF to work with State Board of Community and Technical College to develop a plan to allow the community-based training to qualify for college credit. And the Early Learning Access Bill allows the child care subsidy rates to be equal to or higher than private pay rates in order to support quality. And then it also establishes a 2-year pilot project to create a dual license for foster care and child care. And lastly, the Working Connections Payments Bill. This is the one that there's a 12-month authorization period, and they want it to begin on the date that the child is expected to begin care. This is because of the long amount of time it can take to find quality care, and so they don't want the clock to be ticking while the family is searching for care, but to start that 12-month authorization when the child's actually starting care. Next slide. As far as the budget goes, there was about $80 million in early learning policy changes overall, and the bulk of that is for the Working Connection child care rate increase. It's increasing the rates to the 65th percentile of market rates at level 2. It is restoring the Working Connection child care caseload savings, and then there are rate increase in ECAP, and also creating a special needs rate enhancement for providers who are providing care to children with special needs. So most of that is coming. Those are the largest investments out of that. And then we also saw some support in the capital budget to support facilities as well. And so $4.2 million for grants and loans to match other funding sources, and then $3 million for specific. I think there are about 7 early learning facility projects that are being funded with that. Next slide. Okay, so I've identified some bills that touch on state board duties. One is the Innovative Learning Pilot Bill. It also shows up in a different area. There's a lot of overlap here, but this, of course, is Wellman's bill that addresses the big picture schools and the potential funding disadvantage. It allows them to give full-time enrollment apportionment for those students who are in participating mastery-based learning programs. So we have a duty on this one with working with OSPI. We could begin collecting some of the required information on our waiver, our application for the credit waiver, because that'll help streamline things for OSPI as well. And then there is a report that OSPI is to do in collaboration with us, so we'll be working with them on that report. Another one is Institutional Education Bill, and this one has a task force to work on improving the educational outcomes. And our role in this one is that the governor is to appoint a member from the state board to participate on this task force. And I think they get started pretty quick here. So I imagine that we will hear soon. Another one is the Charter School Commission. This is mostly technical. This just allows them to hire an executive director and employ staff. The part that's relevant to us is it changes the date by which the annual charter school performance report must be completed, changing it from December 1st to March 1st. So that's something to pay attention to. And then, as Randy talked about yesterday, we're watching the coronavirus response bill very closely. We're expecting floor action on that bill today. And there is an amendment that we put forward to help address flexibility for the graduating class and potential emergency waivers. So I'm waiting to see if that goes through. And another one to mention that did not pass was the State Education Agencies Bill. This was the OSPI request legislation that had the 3 parts to it. The first part was the, I might have them out of order, but there's the WASDA handling the elections piece. There was the superintendent appointing a designee to the different boards, including the state board, and then that got changed on the substitute version where the superintendent was still going to participate. And then the third piece was the elimination of the school facility citizen advisory panel and putting those citizens onto the technical advisory group. So that bill made it pretty far. This was one of those bills that made it to the be scheduled for exec in-house ed, but it was on the sex ed day where they ran out of time. So this one did not pass, but definitely conversations that we'll want to have and in the interim as we continue looking into that. Next slide. And so beyond our platform, there are a few other bills I wanted to highlight that align well with our strategic action plan priorities. And just a few here. So one is an environmental education bill that this requires OSPI to contract with a local nonprofit to integrate state learning standards with outdoor field studies and project and work-based learning opportunities. Originally, this was more specific to the Pacific Education Institute's field STEM. The final version of the bill broadened that language a little bit, but essentially the same idea. And then budget-wise, there are a few items to highlight here. Some funding for OSPI to develop a civics education curriculum, and this ties in with the voting for youth bill, and so they want to tie that in there. And then, Jeff, I'm happy to point this one out. I know you'll be excited that some funding came through for the Leadership and Assistance for Science Education Reform, and not just Jeff, but I point Jeff out because he's very knowledgeable about this and passionate about this work. And so this is going to help with implementation of the state science learning standards. And so that's something that is part of our strategic plan that we're in support of, and that Laser's been one of the leading organizations in efforts to assist schools in the adoption of the next generation science standards. So that funding has come through in the budget. Next slide. And then under the area of system design, there was a bill on the participation of students who are low income in extracurricular activities. And this one does a number of things. There's a big data component to this bill. And so it has opportunity gap goals for high schools related to the difference in student possession of ASB cards. So looking into gaps in participation rates. And if you have a high gap, to have an opportunity gap reduction plan, and then publishing certain data. Sorry, here, it's a little sniffle here. And then, let's see here. There was a fee part to this one. Policies for waiving fees and streamlining the process for charging and collecting fees. So part of it has to do with the fees, but there's also a really big data component to that bill as well. And then a few other things that came through in the budget related to the idea of extracurricular activities. There is funding to support participation for youth that are in out-of-home placements to ensure that they're able to participate at the same rate as or just as their peers do. And then funding for dual language grant programs. So remember that our student board member, Margarita, had testified on a dual language bill earlier in session. That bill did not pass, but we do see some funding in the budget to support growing the capacity of dual language learning, and also some funding for early learning dual language grants. And then this last item here is specific to a program in Federal Way, but looks really interesting and cool. I hope we'll learn from what they're doing there. And it's an after-school and summer learning program specific to the Latinx students. Okay, and then in the area of student transitions and diploma, we have a few bills here. The high school child care bill allows parents who are attending high school or pursuing a high school equivalency to be able to be eligible for the Working Connections child care subsidy, and also requires school districts to provide transportation if those student parents request it and they're transporting an infant. The Higher Education Access Bill, this one has a lot of responsibilities for the Student Achievement Council, including a centralized online statewide calculator tool to estimate financial aid packages, and then some work to arrive at consistent definitions of financial aid award packages. The part that's most relevant to the K-12 sector is that beginning next school year, all districts with a high school must provide both a financial aid advising day and notification of financial aid opportunities at the beginning of the school year to parents and guardians of any student entering the 12th grade. There's going to be a WASDA model policy. There's WASAC training opportunity optional for districts. And the one part that we had provided feedback on is wanting to see this align with requirements that already came through last year of the high school and beyond plan. And we did see that come through a little bit. We were hoping it would be more flexible to kind of allow it to align with what districts are already doing to implement the high school and beyond plan. And so it does say that they can administer this in accordance with those requirements, but there's still an expectation of dedicated time during regular school hours, sometime between September 1st and December 1st. And OSPI will be supporting that and coordinating statewide as well. And then it modifies the high school and beyond plan to require additional scholarship information as well about the college grants and other scholarship opportunities. Okay, and then the Running Start pilot program, this has OSPI work in consultation with State Board of Community and Technical College to establish a Running Start summer school pilot for 2 years in 3 community colleges. And the idea here is that this will allow students to participate over the summer. In order to be eligible, they have to be enrolled in either 11th or 12th grade in the coming school year, or have graduated in the current school year and have 5 or fewer college credits to earning an associate degree. So if they're close to earning an associate's degree, they can participate in the summer to finish that up, or if they're going into 11th or 12th grade. And the idea being that this is a nice way to be able to kind of test that out before taking on a full load and having other responsibilities that you have during the school year. And then just wanted to point out that the posthumous diplomas bill did not end up passing. And then under funding and accountability, we already talked about the innovative learning pilot bill. I put that one under this category as well. And then one that did not pass was the school staff funding bill. This is the staffing enrichment work group recommendations bill. That did have a public hearing in early learning and K-12 committee, but was just kind of acknowledged as being too big of a lift for the supplemental session. So I think we'll be seeing that come back. Next slide. Thank you. As far as our budget request, the one we had on local development of credit-bearing high school and beyond plan options unfortunately did not get funded. We did have pretty strong support, especially on the House side, and we had Representative Dolan submit the language for us, but unfortunately did not get this one through across the finish line. I think we'd want to start kind of earlier over the interim to work those and garner support over interim to have a better shot in future sessions. And then also I mentioned we were supporting the additional staff resources at ERDC to support cross-agency data analysis and reporting. And this appeared to be aligned with the Career Connect Washington initiative from the governor. Originally, the governor's budget and the House budget proposal had some funding that for 2 additional staff. What ended up coming out in the budget seems to align with that, but they've narrowed the focus of the language so that it's more specific about higher ed finance. So it's not exactly what we were originally advocating for, but I think nonetheless, having more resources go to ERDC will be a good thing that will help probably support the overall goal of them having more capacity to be able to work on cross-agency data analysis. And so now just kind of a sneak peek at interim. So the House Education Committee had a work session. It was on the same day as the coronavirus work session that Randy and the, OSPI and WASDA had. So, but they also carved out some time to have each member of the committee talk about what they wanted to work on over the interim. And so I'm showing here what some of the most popular topics was student health care for sure, and this includes school-based health centers and other ideas about students being able to access health care. School funding came up, and Representative Santos reminded the committee members that the Education Committee usually does not deal with school funding. They focus on policy and leave funding to the fiscal committees. But she did kind of say maybe they could look into whether that role could be expanded, but because there is a lot of interest among the committee members to look at more equitable funding and levy and LEA and lots of different school funding issues. And then the topic of equity got reflected in a number of different ways throughout, but talking about wanting to close opportunity gaps and acknowledging where there are disparities. So that was popular among the committee members. Other mentions, so it was Representative Paul and Representative Steele are interested in dual credit and CTE. And then the other topics were mentioned just by a single member mentioning these other ones as well. And so this is helpful for us to know if we want to follow up on any of these. I can tell you who it was that expressed interest on the topic, and we'll know who to go talk to. So. Next slide. And then this is just a real high-level preview of what's ahead for us. Wanted to point out some topics that we know we want to work on over the interim, mentioning the agency administration bill that died and wanting to make sure we have follow-up conversations on that one. The staffing enrichment work group, that work will continue and we'll want to be part of those conversations, as well as dual credit and mastery-based learning with that work group and report coming out, what recommendations we see there and whether those might lend themselves to any agency request legislation or anything else like that. Over the interim, of course, we'll want to spend time relationship building, visiting legislators out in their districts, working with our stakeholders and partners as well. And then also guiding principles. I put this on here because our legislative committee, we've been refining our process and very much a learning experience for me with it being my first year working with you all, and I'm hoping to spend some time working with the legislative committee over the interim to debrief on how our process went and to also work on some guiding principles to help give us some clarity in what should factor into the decisions that we arrive at around, what positions to take and what to sign in on and when to sit back, and kind of just some, not that we could ever rigidly follow anything, but just some guidance around those things. And then Randy mentioned yesterday the plan for upcoming board meetings in the future. So just to put on your radar that in July we'll be talking about our budget and legislative requests. And we expect that those need to be turned in mid-September. So we'll be finalizing on or before, but around the time of the September board meeting, and then also discuss the legislative platform, which will be then adopted at the November meeting. And that's all that I have. Any questions?
So, yes, wow. First of all, Jaylee, this was very well done, very informative and concise, and thank you. Pardon?
And thorough.
And thorough, right, but without, and focusing us on where the decision points are going forward. I'm sure we have board questions and all. I'd like to first offer the opportunity to those online, and then we'll go to those in the room. So any member online wish to ask a question? If you do that, please identify yourself.
Yeah, this is Paul. I have a question, or actually two questions. So with the first set of bills that you mentioned that didn't pass, dual credit, equity training, native history, what are we to take away from that? Because those are all equity related pieces. Is there, and with our focus on equity, what's the takeaway from that? That's the first question. And then the second question is, with dual credit, what is the potential role of the State Board of Education in that?
Okay, great questions. Thank you, Paul. I would say on the dual credit bill in particular, that one was pretty controversial as far as the approach, and was somewhat limited by the legislative directive that OSPI had been given to look at how to do things within cost. And so there was some disagreement from different stakeholders on that, and it was going to be hard to get that one across the finish line. And so I do think there's a lot of momentum there and a lot of interest, and you see with the budget proviso tasking the Student Achievement Council to convene a task force and really address some of the hard questions that were raised in testimony. And so they're really looking into those issues and want to firm up some answers before moving forward. And so I think as far as our role, it would be great for us to reach out to the Student Achievement Council, because it doesn't say who the participants on that task force are. And so I definitely think we'll want to convey our interest and would likely be able to participate in that.
Jaylee, can I add one thing on that too? One of the bits of feedback I heard as well is because the way that bill was structured and the phase in of the funding, there was actually no relief for students in the coming year. And so I think there was also a sense that there was time to spend a little more time on this conversation.
And if I can chime in, if there is a board member on this group, if there's anybody interested, please let me or Randy know. So that was one question. I think you had another one.
Yeah, on Paul's other question about the equity related bills that ended up not making it and what we should think about that. I really do think that some of them got lost because of the sexual health education bill, which was very controversial and had a ton of amendments. And so unfortunately, it was a time crunch. The gap of time between the two cutoff deadlines was super short, and it was going to be impossible. So they were scheduled to be exec, which means that there was a desire to pass them out of the committee, but they ran out of time. And during that interim planning session, I believe it was Representative Valdez in particular, mentioned those bills and expressed a commitment to want to continue working on those. So I think he'd be a great person for us to reach out to help him support in that effort. But I would expect to see those come back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other online members? Yeah, go ahead. Any other online members who wish to ask questions before we move to those in the room? Hearing none, let's move, and we will go back to the online members if they want one. So I see Mary, and go ahead, Mary.
First of all, Jaylee, thank you. I want to echo how awesome this was. And my first question is, are we going to be able to get your slide deck? Because you had some great information I couldn't write down.
Yes, yeah, we'll send that out. It was kind of cutting edge detail, so it wasn't ready ahead of time. It's stuff that's happened in the past 24 hours, but we'll send it out to you.
Awesome. No worries about timing. Totally understand. My other question is about going back to the very first page, the tribal regalia graduation bill. Did that get amended to include students who are members of non-federally recognized tribes?
So this one had, there was a companion bill. If you remember, Senator McCoy, I believe, sponsored the companion, which was not specific to, it didn't have that federally recognized tribe language in it. And I think both versions started out that way. But then there was an amendment from Representative Lekanoff that made it more specific to the federally recognized tribes. And when she came over to the Early Learning Committee to talk about it, they did ask Senator McCoy if he was in agreement with that or if he had any issues with that, and he concurred at that point. But Senator Lekanoff expressed an interest in building upon this. So it kind of, both of them seem to be saying that we could start off with this way and explore broadening it. So I'm not sure what all went into that decision and why it moved that direction, but I think there is interest in expanding upon that in the future.
Thank you. I hope we're going to continue to track that, because at this point, if that goes through, you're literally going to have children sitting in the same graduation ceremony who are going to be able to wear tribal regalia and those who aren't. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, Holly. Holly next, please.
So Jaylee, this is a teeny detail, so I totally understand if you don't have it at the tip of your fingers, but I am curious about the free and reduced lunch bill moving schools with this, I think you said 68% threshold into the community lunch program. I don't remember what the bill number was. And that there was a whole, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, yeah, 2660. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 2660. And you said there was a hold harmless clause in there for, I think, maybe LAP and National Board high need school, challenging school bonuses, that they would freeze the prior year. Is it the prior year or the prior 3 years?
I believe it is in the school year immediately preceding. So just the 1 year.
And that bill did pass, correct? I mean, so far it's passed both houses. It's made it all the way through.
Yes. And
okay.
All that said, I should probably double check to make sure that there weren't any like late amend. I went through and I think I pulled summaries on the current version of everything, but I can double check that detail for you as well.
Okay, yeah, because I know that there's schools right on that edge that may be in 6 years and then we're out for 1 year and then in for 8 years and then out for a year. I'd hate to see a school get trapped in their 1 year, you know. That challenging school bonus is a huge benefit to those schools attracting and retaining their most qualified teachers, so.
Okay, do I see other questions here. I had a question, then we'll return to the online participants. So Jaylee, this isn't as much a comment as a question, but in your slide on the things to work on the interim, I didn't see the high school and beyond plan pilot program. And I would think that that was one that we would want to continue to work on, see if we can get it funded in the coming full session. I understand this was an interim, or not an interim, a smaller session, yeah. So I would think that's one we'd want to continue on.
Yes, great comment. And we do have some ideas for that as well. One example is to arrange for some opportunities for legislators to visit in schools in their district, their local district, that are doing this kind of work, and to kind of find some champions who have seen how successful this can be, who might want to support this.
Yeah, and I continue to believe that the issue of carving out time in the school day for there to be a meaningful high school and beyond planning and pathway kind of planning is important and foundational to all this working. Randy, do you have a comment?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to go back to, so the other sort of interim activity around guiding principles. I think the tribal regalia bill and dual credit are two good examples of bills of why we feel like that's helpful or needed, because these are bills where we really liked the underlying policy intent of these, but there were some details that were challenging, and so how we express the support and concerns for the different elements of that is really a nuance that is not really addressed in our guiding documents. And so that's one of those are examples, I think, of where it would be helpful to have some of this. I don't know if Jaylee might want to say more on that too.
On the guiding principles piece. Yeah. And another one that came up for our group was when to sign in to support provisos. So we know broadly, in support of bills that align with our platform and our strategic plan, but wanting more clear guidance around when to sign in on more budget requests coming from different organizations.
Yeah, and the nuance on budget requests is it's a little, there's not really a process. It's not as discrete as a bill where you can say, I support this piece. You can support it. You can sign in on the budget, or you might be able to sign a document produced by an agency or entity that's asking for something. And sometimes they get lists of organizations that support it. So it's a different kind of advocacy than what we typically do on a bill.
And so this might be one for the legislative committee to work on, not only developing our next set of priorities, but if there are bills that are not on our one-page priority, but we know we're going to have to take a position on, so that we have some sense of the board before you go in. I think that's where you're going. Yeah. Is that correct? Correct. Yeah. Okay. So that's where we're going. Okay. So any other comments by board members here? Then we'll go back to anybody online. Oh, I'm sorry, Autumn had something. Go ahead, Autumn, and then we'll go online.
Hi, I was just wondering if we were tracking Senate Bill 6132 at all. It's the one that I testified on in January that would allow for the Learning Assistance Program to support the school-wide behavioral health system of supports. And I'm on the Washington State Legislature page right now, and it says that it's in the House committee. And so I'm wondering if we were watching that at all.
Yes, great question, Autumn. So that bill 6132 did not make it. It didn't make it past the cutoff, and so that one died. But there's the other bill with a similar title. It's a broader title, modifying the Learning Assistance Program, which is 1182. It's a different bill. But what we've seen happen is that when that House bill moved over to the Senate has put an amendment on it that takes a lot of the same components from their earlier bill, the one that you testified on, and because that bill died, they took those components and amended it to this other bill, which has a very similar title, and so they're able to do that. And so what we now see on this other bill, 1182, is that the Senate version of it has those components about allowing the LAP funds to support school-wide behavioral health system of supports and interventions, and those aspects of it that you spoke to in your testimony. So that shows up there, but it's hard to say how it's going to turn out because that's one of those bills that we're still waiting on concurrence for. So I think there's a disagreement between the House and the Senate on the use of LAP funds. And so we're waiting to see. I think the bigger issue, as I mentioned, might be whether or not to tie the use to the Integrated Student Supports Protocol. And I think that's a point of contention as well. So I'm not sure how that one's going to come through yet, but we should know by the end of today.
Thank you. Last call for any member online to ask a question or make a comment. Anybody want to weigh in?
Peter, this is Jeff. I do have a question for Jay.
Jeff, yeah.
So you mentioned, I might have missed it, but you mentioned the sort of interim plans of the House Education Committee. I didn't think I heard you talk about what interim plans for the Senate side might be. I keep thinking as we look forward, the sort of intersection between what we're interested in, what the House is seems to be interested in, the Senate, and even the governor's office would help us with the sort of this next phase of strategic planning and then advocacy moving into the bigger session. So I might have missed the Senate. I apologize for that. But did you talk about the interim plans, or are you aware of what the Senate's sort of interests are? Did you gather that information from them as well as the House?
Yeah, great question, Jeff. So the reason that the Senate was not reflected in this presentation is because they don't do an interim planning meeting the way it's tradition for the House Education Committee to do it, but the Senate Early Learning Committee did not do an interim planning meeting this year. We know that Chair Wellman is very interested in the topic of mastery-based learning, and she, I think, wants to go to the Ina Cole conference again, potentially, if she can make that work. So definitely a lot of interest in that topic. And, but otherwise, there's probably going to be a lot of individual outreach to the senators on that committee over the interim to learn about what they are interested in.
Thank you for the clarification. And once again, I just want to echo what others have said, both to the Legislative Committee and for this presentation, Jaylee. This is tremendous. I really, especially missing the first day, it was useful to hear you present. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else online before we return once more? There's one more board comment here and then we'll take a break. Anybody else online wants to weigh in? Hearing no such requests. Bill, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just want to back up what was already said and thank Jaylee for all the work that she's done and putting this all together. But I also want to make sure, someone mentioned this yesterday too, but get it on the record that a big thanks to Orlando too. Those two as a team up on the hill worked really well together and were, hugely beneficial to us this year. So I want to say thank you to both of them.
Absolutely, yeah, having worked with both of them.
Yes, thank you. And I definitely want to put in my own thanks to you all and Randy and Orlando too. Orlando's been a big help to me, and he's up there right now watching the coronavirus bill for us very closely. He helped with this presentation as well, so definitely want to make sure that his efforts get recognized. So thank you for that.
I did have one quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, this is, just identify yourself for the record, please.
Oh, this is Paul Petrie, and I might have missed this, so I apologize, but is there any sense of the amount of money that might be, or the amount of funding that might go to K-12 around the coronavirus?
Mm-hmm. That is a good question. The coronavirus bill right now has a total of $125 million, but that's not specific to K-12. And much of that is going to go to other areas like healthcare response and all of that. Not sure yet, and there's also talk of whether or not they may even, this is an evolving situation. There's always the potential that they may even need to come back down the road to put more in. But I think the language is broad enough in there to allow the decision making of how that money is going to get divided up. And so it talks about like state, local, and tribal entities being involved in that, but it doesn't divvy it out.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because I actually saw the panel that Randy was on, and I guess the school districts are really incurring some costs around cleaning and buses, and there's just some costs that they're incurring around the coronavirus. So. Right.
Great question.
Anybody else online? And then we're going to wrap this up, this section. Okay, and any other comments here? And we ran 5 minutes over on this, which is not bad at all. How about if we break until 10:05? That'll give us 15 minutes. Is that enough time for everybody? We can remain on track. So we will reconvene at 10:05.